Okay, well, today we're going to be covering 3.1, relations and functions. Goals for this section is to be able to understand that a relation is a function if each element of the domain is assigned to exactly one element in the range, and determine a reasonable domain and identity constraints on the domain based on the context of a real world problem. Now, basically in today's section, we're going to be looking at domain and range, okay? So there are three different types of examples we're going to look at domain and range. First one we're going to be looking at is a graph with coordinate points. Second one, okay, we've got four different problems here, all with coordinate points vertically and three sets of coordinate points horizontally. But they all have the same instructions, want to identify the domain and range in all of these. So what we're going to need to first understand or to recall is what is the domain and range, okay? The domain is the values the graph is satisfied on the horizontal x-axis, and the range is the values that the graph satisfies on the y-axis. So for today, since we're looking at just a series or a set of points, let's say we had a point x, y, okay? All of our coordinate points have x as the first, y as the second. Our domain values in a series of points, our domain is just simply going to be the x values that occur, all right? So if we were told to list a domain, we would just need to list all the x values on all of our coordinate points. And then, as you could probably guess, for the range, we would have all the y coordinates, okay? One main rule, okay? One main rule when it comes to writing down domain and range. Listing the numbers only once, okay? So if we're trying to write down all the values of the domain and we realize that 2 points both have the x coordinate 4, all right, we would only write it down one time, okay? We don't want to have multiple times we write it down. We're only going to identify the domain and range by looking at the points individually and only having to write them down one time. So the first one here, we want to identify domain and range. Domain D, range R, okay? Now, when we want to list the numbers of the domain, remember, the domain are the x's, the range are the y's. So for all these points that we have up here, we don't have to list all of them as a coordinate point, but for the first two, I'm going to. Okay, this first one here has the coordinates of -7, 0. -7 is the x part, 0 is the y part. So all we have to do is take the -7, the x part, and put it in the domain. All we have to do for the 0, which is the y part, is to put it in the range. Now, if we encounter any more -7s for x's, we won't write them again. If we account any more zeros for y's for the range, we won't write them again. This first example, I have it laid out to where none of the numbers are going to repeat for the x's or y's, so it shows you what we need to do. Now, we've already used this point right here, so we can either cross it out, or what I do is I circle it just to remind myself I'm done with this point. I can move on to any other point. Now, on this one, we have 7 total points. It does not matter which order we put the points in, okay? So I'm just going to move on to this next one right here, which is at -4, 3, okay? Once again, the first number is my x, so it goes in my domain. See how they're different numbers? 3 is my range, my y, so we put it down here for the r, okay? And I've used that point. From here, if you don't need to keep writing the coordinate points, you don't have to. So for instance, if you see this as -3, -2, we know we write -3, -2, -3 being the x, -2 being the y. Okay? We should always check to make sure that as we write these, none of them are repeated. If we accidentally write one down that repeated, we can simply just cross it out. So we use that point. This one here is at 1, -7. We have no 1s yet, so there's a 1. We have no -7s here, so we can write it down. Now, I have students today say, oh, don't we have numbers that repeat right here? This -7 is in the domain. This -7 is in the range. It's okay if we have one of each in each of these. We just don't want to write another -7 in the domain. Okay, just like down here, we don't want to write another one that has a 0 or a 3 or a -2 or a -7 for the range. So we're just going to keep on going here to the next point, which is located at 4, 5 right there. 4 for the x coordinate, 5 for the y coordinate. This one way up here is at 7, 10. There's no 7s there, so we write it. There's no 10s down here, so we write it. This one down here is then located at 8, -10. All right, there's no 8s, we write it. There's no -10s, we write it. And since that's the last point, this would be my domain for this graph, and this would be my range for this graph. All right. We have another similar example like this, or to this problem here. So if you want to try this one on your own, go ahead and write it and pause the video to try it on your own. All right. So let's take a look at the points that we have here. Now this one, we are going to have some values that repeat. Hopefully we see that since we have 4 total points on the x-axis. But the process is still the same. This point is at -10, 0. So -10 is my x, 0 is my y. Once we use it, circle it and move on. We have another point right down here at -6, -6. So we put our points down, -6 for the x, -6 for the y. Circle it, move on. Next point we have here is at -5, 5. -5 is the x-coordinate, domain. 5 is the y-coordinate, range. Okay. As we've noticed so far, none of these are repeating in the domain, none of them are repeating in the range. So we just go ahead and keep going here. All right, here we have 0, 9. 0 is the x-coordinate, 9 is the y-coordinate. So we use it, which brings us to our first repeat right here. This is 0, -8. Okay, now since I already have a 0 in my domain, I'm not going to write 0 again. So we're just going to go down to here. I don't have -8 down here, so I will go ahead and put my -8 here. Now this did confuse some students today because they thought, well, if we can't put the one for domain, how can we put the one for the range? We're looking for the different values that we have here for the domains and ranges, okay? So since we already had a 0, we just didn't have to rewrite it again. We haven't had a -8 yet, so that's why we had to write it down here. So we've used that point, now we can go ahead and keep moving on. The next one we have is right here at 1, 0. I have no 1s right there, so I can put it. But for 0, the very first one we had was at 0, the 1 point way over here. So we don't need to put another 0 for the range. Next point was right next to it here at 2, 0. There's no 2s. But once again, we've already used 0. So we don't have to rewrite it again. Next point right here appears to be at 4, -6. Okay? No 4s in the domain, so we can write it. The range, we have another -6, so we're not going to write -6 there. Next point up here is at 6. Hard to read sometimes. Just want to make sure I have it correct before I say it. Appears to be 6, 7. Okay. There's no 6s in the domain, so we're going to go ahead and write it. And there's no 7s in the range, so we're going to go ahead and write that too. Circle it once we've used it. Now the last point here is at 7, 0. We don't have any 7s up there for the domain. We write it. We do have a 0 for the range, so we don't need to write that again. And this would be our domain and range for this given problem. Okay? A lot more points here than maybe we're going to encounter because there was 10 total points here. But you'll notice that we only wrote 6 of them down here for the range since we had a couple values that repeated. And we wrote 8 or 9 of them, so one of the numbers did repeat for our domain. That's why we didn't have to write it there. The graphs are the ones that are a little bit harder to read because we have to deal with looking at the graph. Now, some students prefer to use like a piece of paper. And if they're trying to determine where these points are on the x, they would line it up. So for instance, this one was at 7, they would move it. This one was at a 6, this one was at a 4, this one was at 2, 1, 0, and so on and so forth for the x's. If you'd rather do that, you can. And then also for the y's, you would just flip your paper to where it was running horizontally, and then you could see what y values all of your points are at. Either way is fine. The domain and range for a graph is a little bit harder to recall, especially with just a series of points. Now, when we move to graphs of actual linear equations, quadratic equations, or stuff like that, these will be a lot easier to look at. But as points, they're kind of more challenging to do. Now, when they give us a set of coordinate points, for instance, this set right here, this is actually the easiest way, purely opinion, easiest way to look at these points. Because once again, the domain are the x's, the range are the y's. So as we recall, these are coordinate points. The first numbers are our x's, the second numbers are our y's. But remember, the x's are my domain, the y's are my range. So basically what we're saying here is this the first number in each set of parentheses, the 3, the 2, the -1, the 3, those are our x's, those are going to be our domain numbers. So all we would have to do is write down all the x's for our domain. 3, 2, -1. Now we wouldn't write down that 3 because we already had a 3, so we're not going to write it down because that repeated. And that would be my domain numbers. My range numbers are just going to be the y's, the last number in each of these coordinates. 2, 0, 9, and 6. Okay? So if you want to go ahead and try these last three on your own, since I'm hoping these are a little bit easier to understand, pause the video and try it on your own. Okay, for this one here, once again, it's the same process. If you need to keep labeling these every time so you know XY, 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 or better yet, domain range, domain range, domain range, go for it. Okay, so once again, we look for the domain, the X's here. We have -1, 0, 1, and 2 for my domain. The ranges, we look at the ones here that are the second number in each set of parentheses. -1, we have another -1, so we're not going to write it. 8 and 10. Okay? Hopefully these are seeming a little bit too easy, and that's good because these are not designed to trick us. We just, for the domain, have to look at all the X's. We only have two different ones here because we have 3 zeros and a 1. So we're just going to put a 0 and a 1. This is only going to have 2 elements in this set for the domain. Once again, the range are just the Y values. Let's take a look. 4, 1, -11, and 7. All right. Doesn't matter how many numbers they give us. They could give us one like this one, final one we have here with the vertical points. In which case, domain is just the X's. List them until they repeat, or list them except if they repeat. 10, 0, 9, 4, 5, and -6. And someone did ask me earlier, any order these have to be in? Nope. They do not have to be in any special order, okay? As long as you have them all listed, you will be good to go. Now, keep in mind, you want to probably go, preferences, probably go straight in order. That way you don't forget any of them, and you don't want to separate any of these using a period. Okay, if you separate, like at the end here, or let's say for right here, between the 9 and the 4, if you separate this instead of with a comma with a period, they're going to think you mean the point 9.4. We want to represent the points 9 and 4, okay? So for the range here, we take a look at what we have. We have 3, we have 8, we have another 8, so we're only going to write it once, -3, 5, and then we have another 5, so we're only going to write that once. And this will be our domain and range for that given set of 6 points. Now, the only way they can make this a little more challenging is if they give us the points horizontally, running side to side. Student asked today, could we just go ahead and list them vertically? Meaning I write 2/3, I can write -3, -3, -5, 6, and 8, 9. So I have it vertically. You can do that. Now there is another way we can look at this if we have horizontal points here. Okay, once again, the D is the X's, the range is the Y's. If I just go through all these and underline the first number in each set of parentheses, those are my X values. So we have those points right there. Okay. So my domain is going to be 2, -3, -5, and 8. And the range, my Y's, are the numbers that aren't underlined. 3, -3, 6, and 9. Okay? However you need to do it. I think a lot of students today found this method to be pretty easy to understand. Okay? All right, so if we had to do domain and range for the next to last one here, once again, if I just go through and underline all my X values, the first numbers and all the parentheses, makes it easy to identify. In which case, this does bring up an interesting one here for domain and range, because the domain would be 1, 2, 3, and we're not going to write that second 3. The range is actually going to be 1, 2, and 3. Now, even though this looks different, since the domain and range are exactly the same, when we're dealing with linear functions, majority of the time, our domain and range is going to be the exact same to one another. I mean, there are special cases when we end up dealing with horizontal or vertical lines, but for the most part, our domain range for linear functions would be exactly the same, in which case it would be all real numbers. But that'll be something we get into a little bit later on. Finally, nothing different with this last one here, so let's just take a look how we're going to approach it. We have domain and range. Just like we had before, let's go through every single parenthesis and underline the first number in each of them. That'd give us -4, 5, 6, 6. Oh, what did Mr. Mummy do? He accidentally wrote 6 twice. Oh my God, he's got to redo the whole thing. Nah, just go ahead and cross it out. Okay, if you accidentally wrote 6 twice, just go ahead and cross it out. All right, you don't have to rewrite everything, especially if you're like me and I write stuff with a pen. Okay, just don't worry about it. Just go ahead and eliminate it like that. So let's go to the ranges now. We have 5, we have 2, We have 5 again, so we're not going to write it twice. We have -4, and we have a 7. Okay? Okay, hopefully this gives us a little bit better understanding of domain and range. So once again, we should be able to look at points listed horizontally, points listed vertically, or points in a coordinate grid, and we should be able to identify the domain, all the x values of all the coordinates, and the range, all the y values of all of the coordinates. And keep in mind, we do not want to repeat numbers for in the domain or in the range. Okay, once again, make sure we're getting caught up. We have a new assignment over this one. Make sure we're completing that, and make sure we're getting every other topic covered or any missing assignments in before the end of the grading period. And as always, if you have any questions, send me an email.